Hello, everyone. We are very happy to have you all here. Indeed, as I've been reading in the chat, we're very glad that we have this opportunity to get together again, to have an opportunity to meet and interact with other trainees and local experts from different regions. So first of all, thank you and welcome to this series of webinars, which are follow-up activities of the International Responsible Business Agreement of the food sector from the Netherlands. So we are here once again in a series of follow-up activities this year. We are starting with this first webinar on legislation in the European context and what you can do as a local expert in the due diligence process with international and specifically with Dutch companies. As part of this agreement, as you can see, I hope everyone also can see this screen, we have several parties. Here present as part of the co-organizers are NGOs and trade unions, FNV, CNV, Global March, and Woord en Daad. So on behalf of all of them, I give you once again welcome. Last but not least, I want to introduce the team, but mainly our main facilitator for today. I have here with me Manon Wolfkamp. She is a business and human rights expert. She has been working since 2011 in issues related to the business and human rights sector. She has been training several CSOs on public affairs legislation, which is, of course, the main topic we have for today's webinar. And she has all the time also supporting different companies, mainly small, medium enterprises, in how to do the due diligence process, in the 6 steps that, as we all know, we will see also in a little bit of a recap. But she has been very key also within the food agreement in the Netherlands. So what better person to have here with us today and teach us a little bit more on this legislation framework, on the due diligence steps, and also later on we will interact about our roles. So yeah. Welcome, Manon.
Thank you.
And I'll give the word to you. And we just keep interacting further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Just to reiterate quickly the goals of today, so we're informing you on the latest developments and the content of EU and Dutch legislative process. And mainly we will discuss your role as an expert or a facilitator when European or Dutch companies approach you for assistance on how to comply with these new laws. Just going over the agenda, Angela just introduced what we're doing today, and we'll start with a small recap. What are we talking about? What is responsible business conduct? What is due diligence? Then we'll move towards legislation and the different legislative procedures that are currently in process in Europe, in the European Union, and also in the Netherlands. And then we'll have breakout sessions and we'll discuss the different roles you can play as an expert in supporting companies to comply with these different laws. And then we'll briefly touch upon what's next. What are the next webinars that are organized by this food agreement? I like this session to be very interactive. So please just raise your hand if you have a question. There will be a Q&A after each block, but don't hesitate. Please ask questions whenever you feel a question popping up. Raise your hand. For me, it's very helpful if not only you would state your name and your organization in the chat. I cannot see the chat, but I can see all the participants. So please, on the participant list, fill out your name and which organization you work for. That will help me in addressing your questions as well. So that's it for now. So please, again, don't hesitate. Ask questions. If I go too fast, just ask me to repeat. If something is not clear, ask me to elaborate. If you have a comment to share or an experience to share, please do so. Let's try and make this webinar real interactive, and let's make sure you're here and you really conclude this webinar by saying, oh, I learned something new. So for the small recap, what are we actually talking about? I always like to start with 2 different concepts. So some of us really talk about responsible business conduct, and others really talk about corporate social responsibility. And they're used interchangeably. So it's quite hard. And is it the same? Is it really the same? Is something else? It really depends on your cultural context, which concept you use. But it also really depends where you are, what it actually means. So I think it's very good to to make this clear up front, that what we're talking about is really about making sure that business operations and business processes become sustainable. So this is not about a business funding a school or a business funding a local soccer team or a business doing charity work, which is great. I mean, this is really great that business is doing that, but that is often referred to as CSR. Corporate social responsibility. Business has a role to play in society, and they do this by sponsoring or by subsidizing or by giving charity. This is a great role of business, but this is not what this webinar or this whole series is all about, and also not what legislation is really about. This is really about responsible business conduct. So really making sure that business operations become more sustainable, human rights, on climate and on environment. So it's really also about purchasing practices of these businesses. It's really about how you deal with human rights impacts that are found. It's really about your own procedures as a business. So I just wanted to make this distinction. Maybe in your context, CSR means responsible business conduct, or maybe the other way around, but we see now in international fora and also within UN and within the OECD, when we talk about due diligence, we talk about responsible business conduct. So I already mentioned the UN. I think, as was told to you before, the UN was really laid the ground rules, the framework for what we're doing and what is responsible business conduct. And this was first laid down in the guiding principles on business and human rights, the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And these were developed by Professor Ruggie, a process of 50 or more consultations worldwide, multi-stakeholder. And they came up with 3 pillars. Pillar 1, the responsibility of the government to protect, or the duty, sorry, of the government to protect. Pillar number 2, the responsibility of business to respect. And pillar number 3 is access to justice or remedy. So these 3 pillars are an integral part of this whole framework, but we are really talking about pillar 2 and in part about pillar 3. So this is really about the responsibility of business to respect human rights. And this responsibility is being slowly turned into a duty. So the responsibility to protect human rights, to respect human rights, is turning into a duty to respect human rights with all of the legislative procedures coming up, which we will discuss later on. So these United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were endorsed in 2011 by a vast majority. This is really welcomed worldwide, business, but also governments and trade unions, NGOs. Everybody said this is the way forward. This is the way how we should deal with human rights in entire value chains. And this was also further endorsed by the OECD. So the OECD developed guidelines, or they actually revised their guidelines into a 2011 edition, and they incorporated all of the concepts of the UNGPs into the OECD guidelines. And they went further. They developed a lot of different guidances. A very general guidance, which I would really advise all of you to read, is the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct. The OECD developed this guidance in 2018. It's really, really very clear. It's very worthwhile to read. There's a lot of examples in there, a lot of practical advice they give you. And the other one, of course, very relevant for this sector, is the OECD FAO guidance for responsible agricultural supply chains. A little bit more difficult to read, I think, than the guidance actually is, but still worthwhile to read because it really goes into the main dilemmas and concerns within the agri-food supply chains. So what is the core concept then of responsible business conduct? What is that makes it such a good concept? Of course, that is the concept of human rights and environmental due diligence. Just to be very clear, in the UNGP, so in the UN document, there was only a reference to human rights. But then when the OECD incorporated due diligence, they said it should not just be on human rights, it should also be on environmental impacts. And now you will see, next week there will be a new revision of the OECD guidelines, and also climate will be included. So we will have human rights, environmental and climate due diligence in the end coming up. So what is it? It's a process that should be carried out by business. Right? They should identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address potential and actual negative impacts on human rights, the environment, and climate. They should really evaluate their own operations and their entire supply chains and other business relationships. And these other business relationships refer also to the value chain. You could say that the OECD guidelines really refer to the entire value chain. So also to recycling, also to consumers. Right? There's a big responsibility. So this is really a continuous process about risks and adverse impacts for others, for stakeholders outside of the business. And so it's not about risk for the business itself. It's really about risks for others. Just to clarify a little bit more the difference with traditional compliance. First of all, we move beyond for tier 1. Right? So usually there was a lot of audits say, okay, you have a responsibility for your own operations and tier 1. But now we really move beyond. We also move to subcontracting. It's risk-based. Right? So it means that we focus on how a company causes or contributes to harms in the entire supply chain, value chain. So business is also required to evaluate its own purchasing practices. And then it really focuses on effectiveness. What actually works? You need to evaluate and monitor what you're doing. What works, what doesn't work, and you are also allowed to adjust and address this. You need to include or involve stakeholders and workers throughout the entire process. In each step of due diligence, you need to involve your stakeholders. And finally, you really need to make sure you also provide an access to remedy if you cause or contribute a negative impact. And this is what we often see in a lot of different publications, but this is really the due diligence cycle. These are the 6 steps of due diligence. First of all, you design a policy and you embed it into your policies and management systems of your company. You identify, assess adverse impacts in all of the business operations, the entire supply chain, and other business relationships, meaning the entire value chain. You seize, prevent, or mitigate adverse or potential or real adverse impacts found. You track, how am I doing? You monitor, did I design the right methodology to deal with all of these impacts? You communicate, very important. And finally, when and if relevant, if appropriate, you provide for or cooperate in remediation. Finally, to kind of conclude, key aspects of due diligence. First of all, these are internationally recognized standards by the UN and by the OECD. This is not coming from Europe, it's not coming from the US, it's really internationally recognized. It's quite vital and important, I think. It works preventively, so it's really focusing on prevention to make sure that these potential adverse impacts don't happen. But if they do happen, remedies included. It's really dynamic and ongoing, flexible process. So if you start with step 1 and you identify your salient risks, you make sure in step 3 or in step 4, when you're monitoring, new information arises that might feed back into step 1. Right? So this is really an ongoing process. Companies also often start with step 2. They start with identifying negative impacts before they start writing their policy. Right? And this is really up to business how they want to approach this, as long as in the end they do have this policy. Make sure in doing this entire process, there's extra attention for gender and other vulnerable groups, like, for example, handicapped people or children. It's very difficult to address these groups. So make sure, and as a local expert, I think you play a very vital role in providing access to these groups for business. Then the whole due diligence process is really proportional. So a small company with lesser negative impacts on value chains have a lesser responsibility than big multinationals with a lot of negative impacts. Stakeholder involvement, I already referred to that. In each and every of the 6 steps of due diligence, stakeholders need to be involved. And finally, and this is very crucial, it is a shared responsibility between all the different partners in the supply chain. This is not about a retailer from Europe shoving down responsibility into the value chain towards production countries or towards the smallholder farmer. This is really about a joint process in which each and every partner in the value chain takes its own responsibility. I think this is really key of due diligence. This was a very brief recap. I know I just touched upon some of the issues, but you already had a very elaborate introduction into this concept. So across Europe, and actually not just across Europe, but actually across the globe, because also in Australia they're working on legislation, and also in the US they have this forced labor legislation. But across Europe you really see this push for legislation. Civil society really said, since 2011 we have these voluntary guidelines And companies need to implement them, but companies don't actually implement them. Most of them don't. There are some that do, it's great, but there are many that don't. For several reasons, they might not know why, how to do this, it might not be a priority, but they don't do it. So civil society in Europe really is driving for legislation. And they're not doing this alone. They're really joined by business. They're really joined by progressive business that says we need this to become legislation because we don't want to be the only ones doing this. Our impact can be a lot greater if there's legislation that all companies need to implement due diligence in their business processes for human rights and environment and climate. So we started in France, which had the first law, the Loi de Vigilance. Then Germany followed and Norway followed. So there are 3 companies in Europe now that have brought due diligence legislation. There are proposals on the table in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Belgium, and since 2 weeks ago also in Luxembourg. So there are several other countries that are developing legislation. But maybe most importantly, there's a big drive in the European Union to come to European due diligence legislation. And there are 4 different initiatives that I want to discuss with you guys. And again, don't hesitate to ask questions because it can become a little bit complicated. So first of all, we have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, or the CSDDD. Which is really a broad due diligence legislation. I will go into it, but it's really about business being obliged to do due diligence for environment, climate, and human rights. Then we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. This is an old directive. Before it was a non-financial reporting directive. It was updated. Now it's really on. Now it applies to a lot more companies. And it's become more stringent, and it's really about reporting. Then there's the deforestation regulation, which is a regulation, which means it applies to all of the European countries in the same way, and the forced labor regulation. I will go into these 4. First of all, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. I will start with this one because it was actually the first one that was approved within the European Union. So they actually started with the reporting directive. And this is a reporting requirement for European companies with more than 250 employees and all stock market listed companies. So also smaller companies that are actually on the stock market that are listed. So what do they need to report? First of all, they need to report on their business model and strategies, on their plans on how to make sure they don't have CO2 emissions, on the impact of the sustainability risks and opportunities they see, and on how their strategy and plans affect stakeholders outside of the business itself. They need to report on their sustainability goals and their progress. They need to report on their due diligence processes. They need to report on their main and potential negative impacts throughout the value chain, or supply chain. There's still a little bit of debate there going on. They need to report on the role of management, and they need to report on a company's main sustainability risks. This is quite far-reaching. The reporting requirements that are developed are really detailed, and many companies are very concerned about this directive, on how they're going to deal with this. They are developing new reporting standards within Europe, so a whole big set of indicators is being developed, indicators on governments, on social indicators, environmental and climate indicators. They're all being developed right now, and companies need to report vis-à-vis these indicators in the coming years. So as from January 1st, 2024, companies need to prepare themselves to report on 2024 in 2025, only for the bigger ones, the smaller ones after the year after. And so they need to report on dual materiality. What does that mean? It means you report inside out and outside in, meaning you report on the outside world, how it affects the financial situation of your business, for example, climate change or other big changes that are happening, but also you report on how your company's activities actually affect the outside world. So this is double materiality, I cannot pronounce it. So this is a very vital and they say groundbreaking directive that will really make a lot of change in the way how we communicate and especially how companies can be held accountable for what they do. And whatever they're saying and whatever they're reporting on will be controlled by real auditors, right? So by the not just by themselves, but it's really a responsibility of accountants to make sure that what they report is right. So that's the CSRD. Next one is the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This directive requires due diligence for companies that produce goods and services for the European market. So it doesn't only apply to European companies, it also applies to companies outside of Europe that want to sell on the European market. That's really quite key. So this is still in the proposal stage, right? So the Commission made a proposal, then the Council, meaning all the member states, the governments of all the member states, they discussed the proposal and they made their own compromise proposal. And now the European Parliament, tomorrow actually, will vote on their proposal on this same topic. Right? So for this webinar, I've chosen to go over with you, not in detail, but like as a bird's eye view, on the Commission proposal and the parliamentary proposal. Because the Commission proposal we could see as the least ambitious, and the parliamentary proposal actually the most ambitious. So I thought, let's explain these two to you. The Council is somewhere in between. But this is still not like different from the CSRD, the reporting directive. That's done. I mean, that's now being, member states are now disposing it into their own laws, national laws, but that's done. At the European level, it's clear what's in it and what's requested of companies. But the CSDDD is still in the negotiating phase. We'll enter a trilogue phase in full, probably, on what the actual directive will look like. But to give you a clue where we're going, I will discuss with you these two different proposals. So first of all, the Commission proposal. They say that the directive will apply to companies with more than 500 employees and in high-risk sectors, which includes agriculture, more than 250. Then the European Parliament proposal gets rid of the high-risk sectors, but says it applies to all of the companies with more than 250 employees, but in a staggered way. So the companies with 250 employees, it won't apply to them until 2029, which is still quite far from today. So what is asked? The ask is mainly the same, like they integrate due diligence in their policies, they identify actual potential adverse impacts, they prevent and mitigate and stop these impacts and effects, they establish grievance procedures, they monitor the effectiveness and they report. And then the reporting requirement ties in with the CSRD. So under the CSDDD, companies are required to communicate based on the CSRD. You can see here that all the 6 steps of due diligence are covered, which is quite vital. But the devil's really in the detail. So if you really look carefully to all of the different proposals, you can see there's quite some difference. So first of all, the Commission proposal applies to the whole value chain, while the Parliament excludes use. What this means, we're not quite sure yet. But at very minimum, it excludes use by consumers. So business is not responsible on how consumers are using their products. That's first. Second, the Commission proposal is limited to established business relationships, which is a quite new concept that comes from the French law. And it's really counter the normative framework. It's counter the OECD guidelines and the UNGP. So Parliament said, and actually the Council as well, we really need this directive to be risk-based. It shouldn't be. It should apply to the whole value chain, all of the business relationships. Doesn't matter if they're established or not. So there's a big difference, and it will be also really different in how it plays out, which one is chosen. Then in the Commission proposal, there's a very strong emphasis on contractual cascading and auditing, meaning as a European country, you can write a contract saying to your supplier, you need to make sure there's no child labor in your supply chain. Here's the contract, please sign. So the supplier signs, and the supplier goes to their supplier saying, you need to make sure there's no child labor in your supply chain, please sign. And they sign again. And so it cascades down the supply chain until it ends up where the child labor might actually be happening and where it's most difficult to solve without support of all the value chain partners. So the whole concept of shared responsibility of due diligence is actually annulled by this whole concept of contractual cascading and auditing. So in the European parliamentary proposal, there's less emphasis and there's more emphasis on purchasing practices of companies. I think that's a really important difference. Then stakeholder consultation in the European Commission proposal, it's only if relevant. But in the parliamentary proposal, it's in every step of due diligence, as it is in the OECD guidelines. So these are some of the key differences. But another big difference, for example, is that remedy is not really discussed in the Commission proposal. So yes, grievance mechanisms are included, but not the obligation to provide for remedy. And that is included in the parliamentary proposal. So it will be a really exciting day tomorrow to see if the Parliament will vote yes to this compromise, which was negotiated by some parliamentarians. I really hope they do, because it really raises the bar and it really makes sure that the EU directive will be more aligned with the OECD guidelines. But we need to see. We don't know yet. It's a very complicated vote, and we don't know how it will go. So we'll tell you in the next webinar. And then the trialogue, meaning the negotiations between the Commission, the Council and the Parliament, will start after summer. And then hopefully somewhere in winter, maybe in December or January, we'll know what the new directive will look like. There's a little bit of a pressure on this whole process because there will be elections in the spring of next year, in 2024. And everybody wants to make sure that the negotiations are finished before a new European Parliament is elected. Then we go to two regulations, actually, that are more risk-based. So they come from the risk and not from the company. First of all, there's the deforestation regulation. And that means that importers of palm oil, beef, soy, coffee, cocoa, timber, and all goods that derive from these raw materials, that these imports actually do due diligence. So they need to collect information showing that the product was not produced on land deforested after December 31st, 2020. They need to do a risk analysis based on this information. They need to take risk mitigation measures, like use satellite tracking, make sure they have GPS locations, or do isotopic testing on the material to make sure that they can verify the source. And they need to provide with kind of a digital system that provides access to all relevant information on commodities and products like geographical coordinates and the country of origin. And this will be developed probably at European level. And there will be all kinds of supporting measures for producing countries. And this is already adopted by all of the EU institutions. So now we're waiting for the Commission to set a date when it goes into effect. 6 months after the date is set, the regulation will really go into effect. And this regulation will also have huge consequences for importers of soy oil, for example, or palm oil, because it's not that easy to show with GPS coordinates where it actually comes from. Because palm oil goes to a refiner. And a refiner is not always transparent on the origin of the palm oil. So this will be, I think, a big challenge in how they will enforce this regulation, but it's coming up, so business needs to be prepared for this. Second, we have the forced labor regulation. This is really focused on domestic or imported products made with forced labor. And this is an enforcement mechanism. So it doesn't really require companies to do due diligence, but it gives customs and enforcing authorities the power, or the authority actually, the competence to take the product off the market. So they can do, first of all, they can investigate, do like a broad scoping of which kind of products coming from which kind of countries are really risky. Civil society can also submit, actually, their own research. And then if they say, okay, so this country, products coming from this country, there's a big risk that forced labor is involved, so they can do detailed investigation of certain products and certain economic operators. And then if they actually find forced labor in the supply chain, they can actually withdraw the product from the European market. So it's really far-reaching competence that the enforcement authorities are getting. It also applies to the export of products. So you can also not use forced labor if you're producing inside Europe. The burden of proof lies with the authorities, right? So it's the authorities that needs to prove that the product was made with forced labor. And it covers the entire supply chain. It's still a Commission proposal. The European Parliament is discussing it as we speak. but that's it. So we don't know. We don't know exactly when it will be enforced. We don't know what it will look like. I assume it won't be finished before the elections of next year, so this might be pushed to a very long term. So these are 4 relevant EU legislative proposals for the agro-food supply chains. There's one more in the Netherlands I would like to discuss. The broad due diligence legislation proposal that's here in Parliament. It's being debated here in Parliament. It's very much aligned with the OECD guidelines. It includes all of the 6 steps. It would be applicable to all companies selling products and services on the Dutch market with 250 or more employees. There's a general duty of care for all companies, no matter how big or small you are. There will be stakeholder consultation every step of due diligence. It has public, civil, and criminal enforcement. So that's quite tough. And it's now being discussed in Parliament. So we don't know yet how this will end up, if criminal liability or the criminal enforcement will still be in, or if it will be deleted by Parliament. We don't know. This is also still up for debate. But you can see that all of the 6 steps of due diligence are included also in this piece of legislation. So this is it for me. This is all of the legislation that's coming up that I feel is relevant for the agro-food supply chains. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate.
Good afternoon, good morning. My name is called Rashida Nakauka from Rainforest Alliance. I'm based in Uganda. My question would be on how we could actively participate in the pilots. I know there were some consultations that were done for the countries of origin, and we had a delegation that came from Uganda as part of the discussions for the coffee platform where I actively engaged. They informed us that there will be some pilots for, I think, the CS3D, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And I know that Uganda and Ethiopia was selected for the pilots. So yeah, as a network, I'm just asking whether how we can actively engage in these pilots. I know that it could be best country and selections, etc. But it would be a very good opportunity for us to also act at country level. Thank you.
Definitely. Thanks, Rashida, for that question. I'm actually not sure what the pilots are referring to. I can imagine it refers to the deregulation or to the deforestation regulation, but I'm not sure. I'm looking at my fellow here at the table. Do you know about any pilots? Okay, Rashida, let us find out. We will email you or come back to you with an answer to that question. I haven't heard on any pilots being done, sorry, for the CS-DDD. But they might be there. It's a little bit early for pilots because it's not through, it's not finalized yet, while the deforestation regulation is finalized. So I can imagine it really applies to that regulation. But let me find out and let us come back to you on that, okay?
Thank you.
Jona, I think you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Manan. John Noblesa from Cordaid, based in the Philippines. I just wanted to ask if are there any specific provisions in the legislation requiring or specifying who we can do the due diligence, who can facilitate it, who can do the audits in terms of expertise, qualifications, or accreditation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sorry.
Maybe a joint question there because we did the training before, courtesy of Global March, and do we qualify to be part of these providers? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, so in principle, it's the company who's responsible for doing the due diligence. But of course, they can hire, and they are supposed to hire expertise, especially if they don't have it inside their own company, which is very likely. So they are expected to hire experts. So I think as a local experts, you can play a really important role, which we will discuss after this also, in supporting companies in doing their due diligence. So if you're based in the Philippines and a Dutch company is sourcing from the Philippines, you can really be a liaison for them in the Philippines on knowing what's going on the ground, helping them in defining their salient risks in the Philippines, in their particular supply chain in the Philippines. So, but this is not being stipulated by the legislation on what kind of requirements experts need to fulfill.
Thank you.
Yvonne?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I hope you hear me clear.
Yes.
My internet is okay. Okay, I think earlier 2021, during the EU drafting the directive, I was managed to participate in one of the consultation on the drafting. I think one of the questions that I always raise is in the directive or whatever the EU Parliament try to do in the proposal is how do the transnational legal action can be taken? So does that mean that, for example, a Dutch company, the headquarter in Netherlands, of course, can take action against their own subsidiary in, for example, in Malaysia, for example. Of course, that can be done because you are subsidiary, right? But what if this subsidiary company is a joint venture company, which is, how the mechanism works? Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. Do you mean how Dutch companies can control their own supply chain, or how victims can actually hold companies accountable?
Yeah, I think the main discussion is how you hold accountable, right? So because previously, this is another experience. For example, Singapore government have come out with legislation about about haze pollution. But they take action against company who pollute in Indonesia, for palm oil, whatever slash and burn issues. But I think the Singapore government have trouble to access in the Indonesia due to the different legislation. So I foresee that the EU directive might have the similar problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand what you mean, and this will be a challenge. So there are challenges in several levels. So first of all, a business needs to control its supply chain, which is already challenging because how do you do this? But there are many ways in which this can be done, especially in food industry. There is already a lot of control on supply chains because there are also a lot of food safety regulations. So usually within the food industry, companies know where their products come from. They can trace it to the beginning because they have to, especially if it's organic, of course, then they totally need to. So there is already this, and then they can only exercise control to the extent where they can demand it by contracts. And then if the supplier doesn't deliver, they can break off the relationship, but actually that's not what we want, because we would like the European company to actually support their suppliers in preventing these impacts. So that's the first challenge. And I think this is, for a particular company, if you have long-lasting relationships with your suppliers, of course, it's way easier to implement this directive because you already have these established business relationships with these suppliers, and you can really work with them. You have leverage. You can say, well, we promise to source for 3 years from you if you work with us to implement certain procedures into your business operations to make sure there's no child labor or no forced labor, or that you don't pollute the environment. So this is from a business angle. Then from the enforcement authority, so the Dutch or European public enforcer, they need to check on whether European companies are actually doing due diligence and whether they do so in the right way. And this is, first of all, really about the due diligence procedures set up by these European companies. So, and they need to have access to all of these documentation. And a little bit depending on the country, like Dutch public authorities really have a lot of power. So they can just march into a company without announcement and just say, we now want to see everything you've done when it comes to due diligence. And we can want to see all the emails, all of the reports, everything you've done. So that way they can really control the company to see whether they've actually tried to engage with their suppliers and to use their leverage to change. And then, of course, you have victims that want to hold companies accountable, and this is the most complicated and will still be very complicated also with these new laws. We think access to justice will be improved, but it's still very hard to prove, especially if companies themselves are not transparent. Like, if something happens, for example, at a plantation, who is the end buyer, right? So in Europe, for example, so if it's a supply chain with a lot of intermediaries, how do you find out how transparent is the whole supply chain? That's already the first problem. Then the second problem is you need information from the company to actually assess what they have done in their due diligence. If they've really tried, if they've tried to use all of their leverage, but it just didn't work out, then they might still have done their due diligence, even if it didn't solve anything, right? So this is a little bit frustrating also for us to understand, but it's not that European companies will be, judicially speaking, accountable for everything that happens in their supply chain. It really depends on their relationship to the negative impact, as you've, I think, also learned in previous webinars. So these are a little bit of the different questions that we're dealing with. And I think not everything is clear yet. I think there's a lot we need to learn in the coming years. But if, for example, Indonesia refuses to share information, that's really vital. Judicially speaking, it's very hard for the Dutch government or for the EU to actually force Indonesia to share these documentations or to give public supervisors access. It should always be done by diplomatic arrangement, like, we really need this, could you please help us? You know, and then we help you with something else. So in that sense, it's hard law, but then it's really hard to enforce internationally. Does that answer your question? Yeah?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's happened on the first discussion when the directive was drafted. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Amalia?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm Amalia from Indonesia, from CNP.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, a few years back. Yeah. Yeah. So related with the lobby and advocacy work towards the government. So what is the best lobby message that that we can say to the government in related on how to dealing with this this legislation, and of course our main goals to encourage or to push them to improve the national regulation, for example. So how can we use this legislation to to push the government to improve the regulation in national level?
Thanks, Amalia. I think that's a very relevant question. So we try to think, we like to think that this directive, if companies actually prepare themselves and make sure that they're ready, so suppliers in Indonesia, in your case, if business in Indonesia is preparing itself to comply with this directive, I think they will become preferred suppliers for European companies. Like, the easier it is for European companies to get kind of guarantees that what they need to do in their supply chain is actually done by their suppliers, then it's more likely that they will do business with these suppliers. So for the Indonesian government, I would say it would be great if you could prepare your business and inform them what it is. What is due diligence? What are those six steps of due diligence? What do you need to do? Because also Indonesian business needs to do due diligence because it's a UN principle. Huh? So they also need to do due diligence, and they also need to find out where do the seedlings come from that we use in our plantation, or where do the pesticides come from? And if they actually do this, and if they are transparent about this, that would really help European business. And of course, I think also their own business. There's a real business case for making sure you pay your employee a living wage. There are many benefits for business themselves also. So I think if you come from more of a trade perspective, so towards the local governments, supporting local business in implementing due diligence and these 6 steps of due diligence, I think would really be helpful and would make Indonesian business preferable for European companies.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, but no, you can. Sorry, Dineke will add something to this. Oh, sorry. Well, let's first go to Rashida, and then we'll come back to you, Dineke.
Yeah, thank you very much for that response. Actually, it quite resonates with the current situation. I just want to add on top of that, because as we worry about the companies, for me, I see that companies are already aligned to responding to complying with such due diligence policies. I'm a bit worried with probably the national cooperatives or farmer organizations, and also the contextualization of the whole thing. I know there will not be an answer now, but yeah, I just wanted to bring that there's that worry already. At government level, also there's a bit of a worry whether we have done anything, but indeed there are some things that are already ongoing and they're supporting compliance. So yeah, the worry is a bit on how we could already learn from what is going on, or top up and indeed show that compliance is already ongoing in countries. So yeah, generally just to throw those things there and see how the network can also be very supportive of governments to realize that indeed compliance has been ongoing, and there are already old policies that we have been working on to, but how do we pick up those pieces and see the gaps to indeed fit in the new due diligence policies that are coming up? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's very true what you're saying, and that actually reminded me that there might be one other suggestion you can take to your local government, or to your national government, sorry, is that it's really vital for this European directive not to push the responsibility down the value chain so that it ends up only at local or national level in production countries. Really, each one of the players in the supply chain should take its responsibility. So European companies should pay enough, a fair price, so that actually suppliers can pay a living wage, right? And European companies should have fair purchasing practices. So I think a request from your national governments to European governments or to the EU embassies, maybe a visit to the EU embassy and say, you know, it's really vital that we are, first of all, supported in what we need to do, but also that we have equal responsibility. It's not just us, it's also the European companies that have a responsibility. I think this is maybe a good demand for your national governments. Dineke? Yeah. So yeah, so the question was, do we see a role for the local Chamber of Commerce? That's a very good question. There are, of course, many chambers of commerce worldwide. There's the European African Chamber of Commerce, and there's the EU-US Chamber of Commerce, and there are several. Yes, of course, they play an important role. I know in Vietnam, I know in Cambodia, they're actually developing a platform on business and human rights together with GIZ, the German Development Corporation. Foundation. They're actually developing a whole website with all kinds of tools, and they're really, so these chambers of commerce are really playing two parts. So they help business from Europe in applying due diligence, but they also support local business in how to do due diligence and how they can actually meet these requirements of European companies. So yes, I think the Chamber of Commerce can play a very important role. Yeah. Yes, that's a very good suggestion of Dineke. And actually, you're segueing into the next exercise, which is, I think, if there are no more questions, that might be something we can do now. So, oh, sorry, one more in the chat, but just, so Dineke is just saying that it might also be very good for you guys to actually contact these Chamber of Commerces and see how you can work with them. And if they get a request from a European company, they can also maybe actually refer to you as experts on due diligence. So that's an excellent suggestion. Thanks, Dineke. And then there's one more question in the chat. Yeah, so there was a question on whether European companies will actually support companies from production countries. Am I saying is a correct way. Yeah, train and educate. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, to be honest, most of the European countries have no idea. They don't know what due diligence is about. They don't know how to solve these big issues. They don't know where to start. So there will be already a very big push, a very big challenge actually in training and educating and supporting these European businesses in, okay, what are you actually now expected to do? And I think we as civil society also have a very big role to play in production countries in making sure that their business is also trained and educated on this topic, and that we also keep pushing European companies to support their suppliers. We see that with companies that are actually doing this, that are actually doing due diligence, especially those that have long-lasting relationship with their suppliers, they are training their suppliers. They are working together with their suppliers. So those that really want to and that really sincerely want to improve conditions in their supply chain, they have training programs and they have joint programs. But that's very limited. There are only a few so far. Another question from the chat? Doreen, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, please. Thank you. My inquiry is it possible to have some advocacy material to enlighten the different organizations so that they can know that there's need for human rights due diligence and legislation? When we talk of Uganda, there are things that are so obvious. Someone knows that they need to acquire certification for their products if they're into food processing for them to access market. They know they have to be tax compliant, but when it comes to legislation, human rights, due diligence, they take it as a by the way. So my request, if there could be some materials that, you know, we can do something in our different organizations. We begin there to create that advocacy to let them know that surely there's need for this as well. Thank you.
I think that's a very excellent suggestion, Doreen. I'm looking at my colleagues here to the right, but I'm sure they take up this suggestion and challenge and come back to you with something on this. Thank you. Anything else from the chat? No? Good. Okay, so then we move to the next part of this webinar. We've got around, let's say, 25 minutes left, and I would like to ask you for about 15 minutes to discuss together in smaller breakout sessions. So the 45 minutes doesn't apply. Let's say 50 minutes to discuss in smaller groups what possible roles you see for yourself in this upcoming legislation, and keeping the 6 steps of due diligence in mind. We will use a whiteboard, which we'll explain to you in a moment. But first of all, we think that as local experts, you can really play a very important role. You can really be like an intermediary, you can be the expert, you can be a facilitator in all of this. And we would like to get you start thinking about this. Like, what is it that I can really do? What kind of role can I play? What can I kind of offer as a service to these European companies when they knock on my door, so to say? So again, welcome back to the plenary. I hope everybody's back now in the plenary room. I hope you can, I know this is actually the end of the webinar, but I hope you can bear with us for a couple of minutes just to really get a really fast recap of what was discussed in the other breakout rooms. As if everything is well, you can see one of the whiteboards in front of you right now. And this is the whiteboard of breakout room 2. So maybe I can ask breakout room 1 and whoever was the rapporteur in that breakout room to give us additional roles they foresee besides those mentioned here. And please just mention a few because we really don't have a lot of time left. But who was the rapporteur for breakout room 1? Did you assign one?
Okay, so one of the things that came up was one from the trade unions, of course, to give support to remedy, so access to remedy, so to connect Dutch companies with workers, so and connect and collect complaints if they come up. The other thing was coming from Malaysia, the academia was to see how they can support both Dutch companies and local companies to train on to see how local legislation works and how that compares with human rights due diligence legislation.
Very interesting. I think the trainers and the local experts, local trainers was also mentioned in group 2. I think this is a very interesting role, and especially how local legislation interacts with this. That's I think it's very key. Thanks, Marco. And then room number 3.
There was a...
You had a rapporteur who was...
Yeah, it was done before.
Who was the rapporteur for room 3? Can he or she give us some feedback on what was discussed in your breakout room?
Well, we had to trade unions to increase awareness on triple D in the regions, awareness with the factories. Identifying risks was mentioned, lobby and advocacy towards business associations and governments, but also facilitate companies to help them in public consultations, capacity building in the countries on strengthening intercompany awareness on human rights triple D. Participate in MME, which was said, and also to make tables where companies and buyers could come together and facilitate these tables to see how identified risks could be solved or mitigated, and then it's not local buyers but EU buyers.
Right. That's also very interesting. So for European companies, it's often very hard to understand to whom they need to connect in production countries. Who do they need to talk to? What are the trade unions they should consult, or what NGO should they talk to? So if you can play that intermediary role and organize these kind of tables, it's a very nice idea.
And I think 2 more, which are very interesting, is there might become a lot of material which might not be written in an understandable language. Yeah. So translate this so that also companies, but also CSOs can understand, and workers in companies can understand their rights, and facilitate governments in bridging the gap, and also help them in what kind of legislation could be made.
And which gap?
The gap of the own legislation and the EU legislation.
It's often, though, often it's not a matter of legislation. It's often a matter of enforcement of the legislation. But anyhow, that's... Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think these were all very interesting suggestions. Maybe Angela, I'm not sure if you can be the rapporteur for the final group, or if somebody else was assigned. Group 2, sorry.
Group 2 was Marco.
Yes. No, in this case, I can be the rapporteur. I mean, we were having an interaction, and we also wrote down in the chat. I don't know if it's visible for everyone. Then we managed to put things on the whiteboard. So we discussed several aspects of the roles of local experts, including also what can be a prior step for the diligence, which is a little bit similar to what Ulrike was reflecting upon, just being trainers towards the companies and towards other stakeholders about what is going on, what are the legislations that are out there, what is the due diligence process, what are the different steps. So before entering into a more supportive role towards companies, we can also be more a sort of trainers, as one of the sticky notes says. Then, of course, we very much reflected as well on the role as evaluators or providing risk assessments, right? Providing also connection to which data is lacking, because I think this is a very important aspect as well. On the position of the local experts, there is access to the local markets, the access to data that perhaps companies might not get to easily, and of course reflecting on what all the skills we work on in the trainings. Then we have also, in general, technical support on what is needed from companies, depending, of course, on what they ask from companies is. In other steps, either is mitigating or access to remedy. And also in that, the reflection on what the important role of trade unions are. right? In not only providing information towards workers, but also connecting the workers with the companies and connecting perhaps other stakeholders. So these aspects of technical support can be very broad and specific for different stakeholders as well, depending if you're part of an NGO or part of a trade union. Then our last point was, of course, about advocacy, which was also mentioned before, about the change of legislation. So how we can influence on having minimum standards, for example, of living wage in production countries. So that will help as well, providing a minimum standard for lowering the risks that companies can have. And you can see that as well as another aspect on either, part of the due diligence process, but also parallel to it. So yeah, I think that was what we spoke in room 2. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much. I think these are very nice and excellent suggestions for the very short time we had. So thank you for this. We'll write up a small report on this. And also this afternoon, we have another session with the other side of the world, so to say. And I'm sure more ideas and rules will come out of that as well. So hopefully this will serve as kind of a inspiration for you as well to see what kind of role you could play. I know we're already over time, so I would just like to quickly point you to some of the next steps that we're doing. And Dineke, I think you were doing this, but we have 2 more webinars coming up.
Yeah, we have 2 more webinars. We have an Access to Remedy webinar on the 21st of June, same times as this webinar, and we will have an online closing event on the 6th of July, which only one time from 13 hours to 14 hours 30 set, and there we also will have participants from the companies. We did also roadshows with companies in the Netherlands on this, to give them information on the upcoming the HRD triple and all the other laws. Those are the companies who are very interested to work together with all of you. So you can ask them questions, and there will be a nice discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Dineke. So I want to thank you all for being and participating. And I hope you found it very useful to participate in this webinar. Don't hesitate to ask questions afterwards if you still have them. I think you have contact details of many of the people here within the food agreement and within the NGOs. Don't hesitate to ask these questions. We're here to support you and also to facilitate you and to be able to fulfill your role. So thanks again, and we might meet again. Bye-bye.